In 1906, 6 months before George Westinghouse lost control of his own company, a work crew arrived at Solitude, his private estate in Pittsburgh, with instructions that none of them fully understood. They were not building something, they were not renovating, they were sealing something that had already been built. The foreman's daily logs from that period are gone. The contractor records from the Allegheny County archives covering that specific address and that specific window of time are gone. And the Westinghouse Company files that would have authorized the expenditure for whatever work was done that autumn have never been located. What remains are 3 references in peripheral documents: a letter, a surveyor's notation, and a single line in a decommissioned insurance assessment that describe work at Solitude in terms that no standard renovation project would require. The insurance assessment used the word enclosure. The surveyor's notation described a foundation modification that went downward, not outward. And the letter, written by a junior engineer whose name appears nowhere else in the Westinghouse corporate record, described being instructed to take measurements of something he was told not to document. To understand what may have been sealed under Solitude in 1906, you have to understand what George Westinghouse actually was. Not the biography that appears in the textbooks, the actual record of what he built, how he built it, and why the men who destroyed his company moved with such precision and such speed. Westinghouse is remembered as an inventor: the air brake, alternating current, the transformer systems that made long-distance electrical transmission possible. The public record frames him as a competitor to Edison, a man who won the war of currents and then lost his business empire through financial mismanagement in the panic of 1907. That is the official story. It has been the official story for over a century. And it has a particular shape, the shape of a narrative constructed after the fact by people who had very specific reasons to ensure that what Westinghouse had actually been working on in the final decade of his career never became the subject of serious historical inquiry. The alternating current system that Westinghouse commercialized was not simply a more efficient method of transmitting electrical power. The Tartaria framework identifies a specific class of technology that the old civilization used to distribute energy without copper wire, without metered consumption, and without the billing infrastructure that the post-reset power industry was built to require. Westinghouse, working from patents and principles he acquired through channels the official record describes only vaguely, had come closer to reconstructing that technology than any other figure of his era. Closer, specifically, I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Power plant, the technical drawings for which disappeared from the Westinghouse archives sometime in the 1910s, operated at frequency ratios that standard electrical engineering of the period had no theoretical basis for selecting. Those ratios, when examined against the resonance properties that Tartaria researchers have identified in the civic infrastructure of the old civilization, match. Not approximately, precisely. Westinghouse was not inventing those configurations from scratch. He was recovering them. By 1906, Westinghouse was in trouble. The Morgan banking interests, which had consolidated control of Edison's operations and reorganized them into General Electric in 1892, had spent the intervening years building the financial infrastructure to force a restructuring of Westinghouse Electric. The mechanism they chose was a credit squeeze, executed through the same network of banking relationships that would be used the following year to precipitate the broader panic of 1907, designed specifically to create conditions under which Westinghouse would be required to accept outside board members and surrender operational control of his own research programs. The timing matters. The credit pressure began in early 1906. The sealing at Solitude occurred in the autumn of 1906. Westinghouse lost operational control of Westinghouse Electric in early 1907. The sequence is not coincidental. Whatever was under Solitude was moved to that location and sealed in the window between the moment Westinghouse understood what was coming and the moment he could no longer control his own corporate research infrastructure. He was not storing documents. Documents do not require foundation modifications and surveyor notations about downward construction. He was securing something that could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the people who were about to take his company. Pittsburgh in 1906 is a city whose archival record has a very specific texture of incompleteness. Researchers who have worked in the Allegheny County archives describe a pattern distinct from ordinary historical attrition. Records from other periods are present in the expected proportions. The gaps cluster around specific addresses, specific companies, and specific years. The years between 1904 and 1909 are the most affected. The addresses Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back, flood or institutional transition. But the gaps in the Westinghouse adjacent record do not correspond to fire events. They correspond to a period of active institutional management. Researchers who have examined the accession logs have found entries for materials that are no longer present in the collections. The materials were received, they were logged, and then they are not there. That is not fire damage, that is removal. One of the peripheral documents that survives is a letter written in November 1906, addressed to a recipient whose name has been partially obscured. The letter discusses arrangements at a Pittsburgh property belonging to a principal who has concerns about the security of certain installations. It refers to work already completed and to additional work required before the end of the year. It uses the phrase, the lower levels, twice without explanation, and it contains a single sentence that has made this letter a reference point in Tartaria adjacent research. The principal has indicated that the resonance characteristics must be preserved and that enclosure is the only method by which this can be guaranteed against interference from the new management. Resonance characteristics. That phrase, in a letter from November 1906 from a source with demonstrable connections to the Westinghouse engineering network, describing work being done at a property controlled by Westinghouse in the month before he lost control of his company, is not a phrase that belongs in any conventional narrative. Resonance is not a property of documents. It is not a property of manufacturing equipment. It is not a property of anything that would require enclosure to protect from new management. Resonance, in the framework that Tartaria research has reconstructed, is the operative principle of the infrastructure the old civilization used to distribute and concentrate energy without the wire and meter system that the post-reset industrial order was built to enforce. Westinghouse was protecting something that resonated, and he was protecting it from the people who were about to take over his company and who understood with the same precision that he did what it was capable of. The Solitude estate was built in the 1870s on a substantial property in the Point Breeze neighborhood of Pittsburgh. None of the official descriptions reference anything unusual about its construction. None of them reference the foundation modifications that the 1906 surveyor's notation describes. That notation survives only because it was included in a property dispute filing from 1912, which referenced the 1906 survey to establish boundary lines preserved in a collection not subject to the same archival targeting as the Westinghouse corporate records. The notation describes a modification to the eastern foundation of one of the outbuildings. The modification involved the installation of a chamber below the existing foundation level, with walls of a material and thickness inconsistent with standard construction practice for storage or utility purposes. But the characteristics recorded, the material specification, the wall thickness, the depth below grade, and specifically the note that the chamber floor was not concrete but was described as original substrate, undisturbed, are not the characteristics of a storage vault. They are the characteristics of a space designed to maintain specific environmental and electromagnetic conditions over an extended period. Undisturbed substrate. The chamber was built around the ground itself, not over it. Whatever was placed in that chamber was intended to remain in contact with the earth. That is not how you store documents or equipment. That is how you maintain something that requires a ground connection to function. The broader Tartaria framework identifies ground-connected installations throughout the architectural record of the old civilization. The domed civic buildings retroactively classified as government structures contain, in many cases, foundation configurations that extend into the earth in ways that serve no structural purpose but correspond precisely to the grounding requirements of a distributed energy system operating on resonance principles. The Westinghouse chamber at Solitude matches that configuration. The specific combination of wall material depth and undisturbed substrate floor described in the 1906 notation appears in Tartaria research documentation applied to identified ground connection installations in Budapest, in Riga, in Cincinnati, and in at least 4 locations in the Mississippi River Valley. Westinghouse did not build the technology he was working with. He recovered it. The patents that form the legal record of his work describe solutions to engineering problems that the official history says he solved through experiment and intuition. But examined against the technical vocabulary of Tartaria research, they read differently. They read as a man who had access to principles he could not openly cite, working backward from results he already understood to constructions the patent system could accept and protect. The Niagara transformer configurations, the polyphase system architecture, the specific frequency selections that appear in the early AC generation equipment with no theoretical derivation in the published scientific record. These are not the products of trial and error. They are the products of recovery. And in 1906, as the financial mechanism designed to strip him of control moved into its final phase, Westinghouse made a decision. He took whatever he had in his corporate research facilities that could not be allowed to fall into Morgan's hands, and he moved it to Solitude. He modified a foundation. He built a chamber designed to maintain specific conditions. He sealed it. And then he watched his company be taken from him, knowing that what he had secured was below the ground of a property he still controlled, resonance characteristics intact, protected against interference. Westinghouse died in 1914. The estate was eventually demolished. The property passed through multiple owners as Pittsburgh's industrial neighborhoods were subdivided and redeveloped. What is there now sits on ground last formally surveyed in 1906 in the document that recorded, without understanding its significance, the characteristics of a chamber built to last and built to preserve. The Pittsburgh records that would tell you more are not available. The Allegheny County archival gaps cover exactly the period and exactly the addresses that would be relevant. The Westinghouse corporate files that survived the post-1907 reorganization are held in collections whose finding aids are complete, but whose physical contents researchers have found inconsistently present. The letter with the resonance characteristics passage exists in one copy, in one collection, not subject to the targeted removal affecting everything else. What was sealed under Solitude in 1906 was not a secret in the conventional sense. It was technology that needed to be hidden from specific people who were about to acquire the institutional authority to destroy it, who understood exactly what it was, and who had spent years engineering the financial conditions that would give them access to everything Westinghouse controlled. He beat them to one thing. Whatever is under that ground, it is still there. The chamber was built to last. The substrate was left undisturbed. The resonance characteristics were preserved. The city grew over it. The records disappeared around it. And the history that replaced the real one describes George Westinghouse as a man who lost a business competition and retired in disappointment. That is the story for people who are not supposed to ask what he knew, what he built, and what he hid before they took everything else.